Jesus Christ according to John. Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Name of the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who frees us and draws us together. Amen. So today is Christ the King Sunday, the last Sunday of our liturgical year, the last Sunday in our liturgical calendar. It's also known as Reign of Christ Sunday, or my favorite, Reign of Love Sunday. It's our New Year's Eve of our liturgical calendar. Next Sunday is the first Sunday in Advent, and that's our New Year's Day. And so next Sunday, as we begin Advent, at least here at St. Barnabas, we begin to prepare ourselves for the birth of God, the Word made flesh, God made flesh, born into a tiny little baby, a vulnerable little baby born into very vulnerable situations. That's next Sunday. This Sunday, on our New Year's Eve, we are celebrating the victory of God, the strength of God. We're celebrating a God that is powerful and knows exactly who he is in Jesus Christ, the most powerful force in the universe. And that is Jesus Christ, who is love. So Christ the King Sunday is not an ancient feast of the church. It was started in 1925 by Pope Pius XI between the two world wars, when nationalism and secularism was on the rise, and the Pope wanted to remind everybody what the most powerful power is in the world, that is Christ the King. What's more powerful than the powers of nations and kingdoms and judges and presidents and kings? It is God's love. That is the most powerful force that we know, that we have come to know in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That is the power that is sovereign in our world. So as I was reading this past week, I learned that there's another tradition about Christ the King Sunday, that in some Lutheran communities, it was called Judgment Sunday. Judgment Sunday because it connected to that last line about the Son in the Nicene Creed. He will come to judge both the quick and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. He will come again to judge the quick and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. Now, Judgment Sunday doesn't have quite the ring to it as Reign of Love Sunday. But our gospel lesson kind of has the same theme. So I thought we might explore it a little bit. And for today, let's try to think about judgment by separating it from punishment. Often when we think about being judged, we also think about being punished. But the reality is that when God judges us, when Jesus is our judge, what happens is that we are known completely. We are seen completely, all of us. The good things about us and also the challenging things about us. That we are known completely by God. To be judged by God is to be seen and to be known completely. And as I was talking about this with one of my wise colleagues, Robert Barra, this week, he had another take on God's judgment. And he said that to be judged by God is to know that death has no power. That when God sees us and knows us completely, that our death, the inevitability of our death, no longer has power over our lives. As we say in the burial service, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's possession. So our gospel lesson speaks a little bit to this theme of judgment. In fact, Jesus is standing in being judged by Pilate, being judged for his life. He's standing before Pilate, who is, in the story, the judge. Just to put this in context, this is the last days of Jesus' life. He's had his Last Supper with the disciples. Then he and the disciples go and they pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and there Jesus is arrested. He's brought before the high priests, and then the high priests turn him over to Pilate, the Roman governor who has the power to condemn him to death. And Pilate is trying to determine if Jesus is a political threat. Is he a claimant to power that is a threat to the political stability of Roman rule? Does he consider himself a king? But there's a little bit of irony in this story, because on the surface, it appears as if Jesus is being judged, that Pilate is judging Jesus. But you dig a little deeper, and you realize that, in fact, it is Pilate. It is the chief priests. It's the world. It's all of us who are on trial for our lives. For Jesus is witnessing to the true power in the world. And the question is, will we see and will we know? Will we see and understand that the true power of this world lies not in the pomp and circumstance and cruelty of Pilate's courts or the council of the chief priests, but rather the true power lies in the truth and authority that lie in the witness of Jesus, the Messiah, the Good Shepherd King, who will lay down his life for the world. In this passage, we have two images of Jesus. One is as the judge, the one who sees and knows us, knows exactly who we are. But we also have Jesus, as he is known throughout the Gospel of John, as the Good Shepherd, the Good Shepherd King, who lays down his life for the sheep. Remember, in John's Gospel, in the 10th chapter, Jesus talks about himself as the Good Shepherd. Unlike the hired hand who runs away when the wolf comes, the Good Shepherd is willing to lay down his life for the sheep. These two identities of Jesus, the judge and the Good Shepherd, are made even more clear in this last exchange between Pilate and Jesus. When Jesus tells Pilate, "This is the reason that I was born, this is the reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth." And Pilate responds, "What is truth? What is truth?" Jesus remains silent in the face of this question. Yet his whole life has been about answering it. And he is about to show us in his death and in his resurrection, in his final enthronement on the cross, what truth is. That love, the outpouring of love, the defeat of death, this is the truth. What is truth? The Good Shepherd King tells us that truth is the greatest power in the world, and that is to love. And it's shown through Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection into new life. The truth is that death has no power. And because it has no power, we are free to live lives of outpouring love. So speaking of death, you may have heard that our pastoral care at St. Barnabas, along with the Legacy Society, is doing a series of seminars on aging and death. We had a session on thriving while aging last month, and just last week we had a very informative session on legal planning at the end of life. And right now I'm preparing to do the next seminar that will be in January on the spirituality of dying. It's not easy to talk about. It's a part of our lives. To die is to be human. Who here is going to die? We all raise our hands. Reminds me of my one of those great old country songs. I love the title. Everybody wants to get to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And we don't want to talk about it either. There is great fear in the uncertainty, the possibility of pain and suffering, and in the loss of control. But our faith tells us that death has no power, and that we are free to live our lives outpouring in love and generosity. We are free to be known and to know. And having walked with many of you as a loved one dies, having read and heard stories from hospice doctors and nurses, our experience tells us that the more that we know, the more that we are willing to talk about dying, the more possibility there is for God to be present, for it to be a sacred and God-filled process. I want to read a quote from a book called Dying Well by Ira Byock, who was a hospice doctor. And in the book, he begins by talking about his father's death. And after his father dies, he reflects, "Death was beyond anything I could probe. However, the time of my father's dying, and especially the last months and weeks, pervaded my thoughts and permeated my dreams. The memories were full of compelling images and poignant vignettes that connected me with a deep, aching sadness. Something about the time was also undeniably precious. Dad's dying was certainly not the happiest time in our family's life, but as a family, we had never been more intimate, more open, or more openly loving. His illness allowed us, I could say, forced us to talk about the things that mattered: family, our relationships with one another, our shared past, and the unknown future. We reminisced about good times and bad. We cried and we laughed. We apologized for a host of transgressions, and we granted forgiveness. I share this as an invitation to you to join the conversation, with loved ones and with your parish family. Be not afraid, For Christ is King, love reigns, and the truth is that the most powerful force in our lives is the love that lays down its life for another. The judgment then is that death has no power. The consequence of the judgment is not a punishment, but a freedom. We are free to face every obstacle and hardship, even the inevitability of our own death, together. For Jesus came into the world to testify to the truth. And what is the truth? It's love. Thanks be to God.